Thank you as well for your questions, and thanks to everyone watching at home tonight. Next week, David Spears takes the show to central Queensland to be live from Gladstone Entertainment Convention Centre. He'll continue tonight's conversation around transitioning to a greener future, and joining that panel, Independent Bob Katter, Resources Minister Keith Pitt, Labor Senator Murray Watt, and CEO of The Next Economy, Amanda Carl. And you can join me on China Tonight on Monday. Until then, have a great night.
The ghost of campaigns past, the PM's pick for Health Minister puts Medicare in the spotlight. Chaos and ruin in eastern Ukraine, evidence mounts of rising aggression. Thousands of homes for families in northern New South Wales for those who've lost everything. And heritage advocates in Tokyo lose a battle to save an iconic building. Hello and welcome to ABC News. I'm Nadia Daly. Easter Sunday has brought little respite from hostilities in the federal election campaign. Alongside the economy, the focus remains on healthcare, with the government pledging more money for Australians with diabetes, which Labor has matched. But in the tight race for electoral victory, there are more potshots than policies being offered.
It's the Easter holiday break, but the election campaign rolls on.
I'm begging him.
Nice try. He's the one.
Thank you, buddy.
The coalition's present, not chocolate, but promises to type 1 diabetics to extend subsidies for continuous glucose monitoring to all so they can ditch finger prick tests.
There are 130,000 type 1 diabetics in Australia. Every one of those will now have access to this potentially life-saving technology.
A promise promptly matched by Labor. With health foremost on minds after 2 years of a pandemic, a replacement for retiring Health Minister Greg Hunt has been nominated by the coalition.
It is with a great honour to be able to be named the next Health Minister should we be successful in winning the next election.
Labor, searching for an attack, harked back to concerns she raised 7 years ago about the sustainability of Medicare.
Anne Ruston has made it very clear that she wants to take the universal out of universal health care.
Our government has been absolutely clear that we are not cutting Medicare.
Words are weapons on the campaign trail, as Anthony Albanese well knows. He was asked if he was committed to Operation Sovereign Borders and temporary protection visas.
Yes.
Only problem is, Labor doesn't support temporary protection visas. Another correction was needed, the second on border protection this week.
We support offshore processing, we support resettlement in third countries. We don't support temporary protection visas.
All three strands are needed to ensure we have a strong border protection policy.
There's no change to Labor's policy on border protection. It remains largely the same as the coalition's. And the coalition has no policy to cut Medicare. The major parties are jumping on the slightest errors and ambiguities of their opponents, a symptom of a campaign driven more by personalities than by policies. Melissa Clark, ABC News, Canberra.
Russia's deadline for Ukraine to surrender Mariupol has come and gone. Moscow said the lives of the remaining fighters in the southern port city will be spared if they give themselves in, but there's been no response. And there's growing evidence Russia is ramping up its offensive in eastern Ukraine. The ABC's Sean Rubenstein-Dunlop reports from Kharkiv, where Russian shelling is intensifying.
A strike on central Kharkiv. Once a bustling city of 1.5 million people, considered the jewel of the East. We arrived to find a neighbourhood devastated by yet another missile attack. But these seamstresses feel lucky. Somehow they survived.
I was hurt by a piece of glass. We were sewing when it happened. Thank God I am alive.
At least one person was killed, 18 were injured.
Well, this attack was just 40 minutes ago. Over here, an industrial building completely destroyed, including the sewing workshop on the ground floor. And over here, just metres away, homes completely ruined.
Stunned residents are forced to piece their lives and their homes back together. This is day 52 of the war. More than 1,600 residential buildings have been ruined in this city by Russia's daily, often indiscriminate attacks.
They target civilians, the residents of the city. Many people now have severed limbs. The extermination of our people is going on.
In train stations across Kharkiv, civilians seek protection from the shelling overhead. Families, the elderly and their beloved pets have lived down here for more than 7 weeks. They don't announce trains here now, just missing persons, emergencies and food deliveries. But despite the unfolding terror, life and even maths lessons go on here.
Everything was exploding above our heads when we ran to the train station. My daughter was crying for 2 days afterwards.
What is it like spending more than 7 weeks down here? No natural light.
No, so it's not cool. It's hard to clean your body.
It's stuffy in here and the air smells very lived in. It's hard to imagine that just 2 months ago this station was packed in a very different way, with commuters going about their peaceful lives. And this could be life for a very long time.
These children have become accustomed to a sad reality. These houses were hit by shells and they're on fire, they tell us. More than 80 children have been killed in Kharkiv alone.
Normally, I live at home, but now they're shooting in the streets. It's dangerous to live in a normal house because it can be bombed and that's it. I wouldn't exist anymore.
With Ukraine warning that Russia is massing troops for even heavier assaults on this city, this could be childhood for a long time to come. Sean Rubenstein Dunlop, ABC News, Kharkiv.
A woman has drowned at a beach on the New South Wales coast this afternoon. The woman, aged in her 40s, was treated at Surf Beach south of Bateman's Bay before being taken to hospital, where she later died. 3 others who were among the large group were also taken to hospital. One man was airlifted to Canberra Hospital. A health worker killed in a light plane crash in WA's far north yesterday is being remembered as a hard worker with a beautiful soul. Johnson Macway Manga died after the Beechcraft Baron 58 he was a passenger in crashed near the East Kimberley Regional Airport. He was working as a registered nurse in the region. The WA County Health Service said staff were devastated to have lost a colleague and a friend. The 29-year-old pilot is being treated for burns and other injuries at Royal Darwin Hospital and remains in a serious but stable condition. Investigators from the Australian Transport Safety Bureau are in Kununurra. 2,000 pop-up homes will be built in northern New South Wales to help people who lost their houses in the recent floods. The $350 million project comes as many flood victims were evicted from their emergency accommodation to make way for Easter holiday makers.
Darren Mattick doesn't know where he'll be sleeping next month after floodwaters overwhelmed his Lismore home.
It's been a real shock to not have I didn't realise how much I took for granted, being able to close the front door and have that security and know that I could go back there every day to that place.
The state government has pledged to fund 2,000 temporary modular homes. Darren hopes he and his son will be able to move into one soon.
I've already been asked if I'm interested in it and have expressed or have registered.
The homes will be similar to those rolled out after the Black Summer bushfires. Wollongbar Sports Fields will host the first pop-up village.
Got to work with council to identify the right sites. We have to be able to stand up all of those connections in terms of power and water.
Finding temporary housing has been extremely difficult. A problem made worse when some flood victims were forced to leave hotels and caravan parks to make way for Easter holidaymakers this weekend.
It will take some time to roll out. It's not going to be here tomorrow. I wish it could be.
The houses take about 4 weeks to build, and only 25 will be built here initially. So while the help is welcome, locals say more needs to be done.
We're just at the early stages of our journey, and we need to keep moving forwards.
And with an estimated 3,800 homes deemed unlivable across northern New South Wales, it's a long road ahead. Emma Rennie, ABC News, Lismore.
7 weeks on from the torrential rain that flooded southeast Queensland, the worst-hit schools will finally reopen. From Tuesday, students and staff will be welcomed back at the 6 remaining campuses that had to close. Schools in Gympie, Maryborough and Brisbane were damaged and classes were moved elsewhere. Milton and Rockley were among the worst hit. The total damage bill was $50 million.
We do want to see a longer-term flood mitigation and betterment strategy put in place, and we'll work with the Queensland Reconstruction Authority and on a package going forward.
The state government has thanked the schools that temporarily hosted the displaced students. Now to tonight's special report. Well, if the trend of the last 4 elections is repeated this year, the 2 major parties will once again lose votes to smaller players. Labor and the Coalition used to command a primary vote in the mid-40s, but it's now dropping close to or into the 30s. Labor was once the party of blue-collar miners and tradies, but as they've become some of the highest-paid workers, allegiances have shifted. And at the same time, in wealthy inner suburbs, long-time conservative voters are backing independence on climate change and anti-corruption platforms. And across the board, a lot of voters are simply fed up with the two-party system and looking for alternatives. Tonight's reporter Ashley Raper takes us to regional New South Wales, and Christian Silver visits suburban Melbourne to talk to voters about how trust will influence their decision on May 21st.
Trust. It's at the centre of this election campaign, perhaps more so than usual.
It's a choice between an economic recovery that is leading the world and a Labor opposition that would weaken it.
You deserve a leader who holds the hose and a government that stands up for you.
Yet at this election, trust in the major parties has arguably never been lower.
We've been told a lot of things over the last 2 years and not a lot of it's been fulfilled.
I mean, it comes back to trust, right?
Yeah, you don't trust any of them.
Definitely resonates, yeah. They could promise you the world, but it's when they deliver, and that's what we need.
I'm in the seat of Latrobe, one of the hotspots of the population boom. It's got the same problems as any Australian growth area. Heavily mortgaged homeowners and infrastructure that's struggling to keep up. It's a Liberal seat, but it's marginal. The third-party vote has been around 20% and could go even higher this time. This is Parakshith Jolly's restaurant in what he says is a dying shopping strip. Rebecca Bishop runs a construction company. Lucy Anders is a teacher with a young family who recently bought their first home here. Why do you think the major parties have been losing support from residents who live here in Latrobe?
They're all like actors.
Yeah.
It all feels like they're all on a stage.
Oh, exactly. There is like a pantomime kind of feel to it, and that's not a real person representing real people.
The way they speak to each other is deplorable. I've watched the live parliamentary feed and I've never seen anything like it. You wouldn't talk to anyone.
If your kids would talk to each other like that, you can say, behave yourself.
Politics doesn't get much trickier than here in the Hunter region. It's where so many of the country's competing interests collide. Mining, agriculture, job security, housing. The distinct fault lines have proved tough for major parties to straddle at a local, then national level. And it's left the door open for political outsiders to connect with voters.
What sort of life is it? Seriously.
Hi.
Hey.
How are you?
Yeah, good.
Thanks for coming.
Pleasure.
Peter Dunn, you're a real estate agent. Anita White, you run a disability support service. And Steve Fordham, you're a Kamilaroi man who runs a local business with mining contracts. Now, coal is critical to this region, but we all know a change is coming at some point. Do you have faith that there is a plan?
No, actually, they all talk about the destination, but no one's got the plan to get there, the roadmap.
No, it's a very guarded secret if it is.
If they do have one, I don't think we've ever seen it. We need a transition from coal, and I think we need to look at a diversification from coal.
And the problem with the transition that they say, it doesn't just affect coal miners, it affects industries like us. You know, people in disability who are working for our mining contracts. And I think until we see that plan, we won't have confidence in any government.
Trust has been deteriorating over the past 10 years. A survey done after the last election shows only 25% of people believe a government can be trusted, the lowest recorded. It peaked at 2 elections when the government changed. Since the 2007 election, votes for major parties in lower house seats have declined. Are things changing and people are more open to looking outside the major parties?
Definitely now, actually, yeah, totally, yeah, and that's been the way for probably the last few years here. I think people are much more flexible to leave parties, whereas before there wasn't much thought put into it. Say 20 years ago, you're either one or the other.
For years, we've been a safe seat for the Nationals in the state, and for the federal, we've been for Labor, and I think people are looking for something different.
How much do you think trust plays into it?
I think it's got to be everything. Any leader that we're sending, we need to not send a sheep, we need to send a lion and stuff the party line. People don't want to see the party line anymore. We want to see people cross the floor if it's what's best for the area.
I want to see more of the crossing of the floor. I want to see people actually voting for policies that they believe in. I'd like to see more of people, the ministers, voting based on policy, not based on party. I think that's the start of a great change.
Do you think more minor parties or independents would make the political system better?
It does, because there's more accountability.
I would favour an independent candidate because for me it seems like they have agency, they have the freedom to respond to each issue based on their values. My biggest concern is to what extent, if in voting for a smaller party, is it a wasted vote? Because they will never form a majority government.
Have you decided who you're going to vote for, and if so, how did you reach the decision?
I wouldn't even know who the candidates are.
I don't,
as you were saying before.
Nobody has come here. We don't even know who's standing for elections.
Come out into the community and get to know your people, get to know your businesses, because we are the backbone. Like, the businesses are the backbone.
That's who they're representing.
Exactly.
And these are engaged voters. Parakshith Jolly recently quit the Labor Party. Steve Fordham has just joined the Nationals, he says, to help open doors to get things done in business. Since the pandemic, Rebecca Bishop has been trying to lobby politicians about a lack of mental health support.
I got pushed from person to person to person. Listen, respond, take the time. Everyone that I've contacted, there's generally an automated response.
Do you still think people trust the system?
I would say no.
And why do you think that is?
I think because it's false promises that we've had in the past and no action.
And Peter, do you personally still have trust?
Well, I do live in hope, actually. I think it wouldn't be hard to change. They just got to back up what they say, and that's the judge of any person. Do you do what you say you'll do? It's a great opportunity right now for someone to show a bit of leadership.
What can they do to win back your trust?
It all comes back to the way that they communicate and a responsibility to communicate in a variety of media. If you could just respond to a story on Instagram, that would be a lot more accessible than having to write a letter for someone from my generation or younger.
I'm eternally optimistic. I never give up. And Australia it's an incredible country. You need people in power and people who have the ability to change people's lives to actually do that.
A Lego-like Tokyo building dubbed the Capsule Tower was supposed to evolve with the times. But since the 1970s, this unique piece of architecture has instead turned into a time warp, and it's about to be dismantled. North Asia correspondent James Oaten took a tour inside the unusual cube apartments.
This strange tower may look like a pile of old washing machines, but it's one of Japan's most important pieces of contemporary architecture. Tatsuyuki Maeda loved the tiny cubes so much he bought 15 of them. This one was kept in its original 1972 decor.
I wanted to protect this building, so that's why I kept buying more capsules.
At just 10 square metres, the apartments originally came with a few basic comforts. But they weren't designed for ordinary living, but rather a place for businessmen to sleep after a late night at work.
It's very small, and the windows didn't open at all, so the ventilation wasn't good.
The Nakagin capsule tower was built in a rapidly changing Tokyo, prompting young architects to see cities as living, evolving things. Each capsule was intended to be taken off and replaced every 25 years, but that never happened.
It was assembled from the bottom up, so they couldn't easily replace just the middle part. As a result, they had to remove all the capsules at once, so it wasn't easy to change.
Unable to evolve, the capsule tower fell into disrepair. Fans gathered to take a final photo as demolition officially began. Supporters of this building say Tokyo has a pretty poor reputation for knocking down some old, unique buildings and replacing them with some rather uninspiring designs. We don't yet know what's going to be built on this site, but the loss of another unique structure is fueling calls for better heritage protections.
I fear Tokyo will become a dull city.
It's hoped the cubes will live on in showrooms and museums across the world. James Oaten, ABC News, Tokyo.
Carlton has hung on to win by 3 points over Port Adelaide at a thriller at the MCG. The Blues squandered a 50-point lead in the second quarter to find themselves with just a 2-point buffer midway through the final term. The result gave the Blues their 4th win from 5 games, while the Power are winless. Last night, Melbourne thumped Greater Western Sydney by 67 points to stay undefeated.
A relieved, if a little lacklustre, rendition of the club song. It could have been a very different tune.
They're not just back the Blues, they're back to stay.
On the cusp of half-time, the Blues led by 50 points. The forward duo of Charlie Curnow and Harry Mackay were dominant. But a dramatic second-half resurgence from the Power cut the margin into pieces. With a minute on the clock, Carl Amon had a chance to put the Power in front.
Behind is a huge win for the Blues.
But the Blues clung on to maintain their winning ways.
Yeah, it was a pretty crazy finish, really. Not how we would have liked it, probably in the position we were at half-time. So, yeah, we've still got a lot to work on.
Despite the fight back, Port Adelaide is now dealing with its worst start to a season, heaping pressure on coach Ken Hinkley. There's pressure on GWS too, who were demolished by a ruthless Melbourne last night.
Max Gawn, clean possession, he's got another one. Too good.
14 points up at the main break, a 10-goal third quarter from the Demons blew the game open. Their usual stars shone, and Keziah Pickett was electric with 3 goals.
Because he's got 3! One of the great goals!
The reigning premiers remain the only undefeated team in the competition. The Giants, who went deep in last year's finals, have registered just 1 win in the opening 5 games. Brad Ryan, ABC News.
Essendon has lost its 4th match in 5 games to start the season, thrashed by Fremantle by 48 points at Docklands. Both sides applied extreme pressure in the opening half as the Dockers went to the main break with just a 3-point lead. But it became one-way traffic in the third as Fremantle booted 6 unanswered goals to effectively end the contest.
The kick back inside, Brayshaw, the goal was there, and he finds it. Another target struck by the Dockers in this quarter.
It's the second time in 2 seasons the Bombers have started the year with just 1 win from its opening 5 games. The St George Illawarra Dragons have claimed their 2nd win of the NRL season, downing the Newcastle Knights 21 points to 16. With scores deadlocked 16-all in the 78th minute, it was 2 individual performances that saw the Dragons pull off a nail-biting finish.
Newcastle having lost 3 in a row and the Dragons beaten in their last 4. Both sides were desperate for a win on Easter Sunday. St George Illawarra gave the home crowd something to cheer about, taking a 4-point advantage into the second half.
And has gone over for St George Illawarra.
The Dragons looked in control.
Scores for the Dragons.
Before Bradman Best burst through, helping the Knights level the score. With 2 minutes to go, a field goal put the Dragons in front. But it was Matthew Feagai's 2nd try that put the result beyond doubt. The Dragons taking home the chocolates. Some of the biggest names to wear the Roosters jersey came together to celebrate their 2002 grand final victory over the Warriors.
Fantastic to see all the boys again, not seeing some of them for, well, 20 years.
But the New Zealanders were out to make history of their own at the Sydney Cricket Ground.
And the Warriors scored the first try as well.
The Tricolours fought back in the second.
And the Roosters lead it for the first time at the SCG.
Finishing with 3 tries to 2.
Walker spinning his way through it, saves the try. In the air.
Far from their glory days, but the Roosters did enough to secure the win 22-14.
It's been a sort of a tale this year for us. We've sort of started off a fair few games slow this year, and we know we need to build on that.
Taking a quick look at the weather in the capital cities for Monday. Brisbane, partly cloudy, sunny in Sydney, partly cloudy in Canberra. In Melbourne, some rain. Hobart, morning showers. A rainy day for Adelaide, a sunny day for Perth, and clear skies for Darwin, getting to 34 degrees. And that is the latest from ABC News. Remember, you can keep up to date at abcnews.abc.net.au and on ABC iView. I'm Nadia Daly. Thanks for watching.
We can't undo the lies we had to tell, girls.
I'm Finn, Dennis's son.
You have no idea what he's capable of.
How do we know that you are what you say you are?
I knew my dad, he wasn't a murderer. I knew he did it.
Family is the only thing that matters in the end.
Smother, Friday on ABC TV and ABC iView.
Anzac Day. Commemorate with us. Tune in from 4:30 for a full day's coverage, starting with the dawn service live from Sydney. Then we cross to the Australian War Memorial in Canberra, followed by a news breakfast special and the marches from your state capital. Later, we remember the fallen,
whose spirit will forever be part of Australia's identity.
as we travel to Gallipoli and Villers-Bretonneux. Anzac Day across the ABC.
Anthony Albanese stumbles on the economy, while Scott Morrison resists pressure to dump a controversial candidate. The first week of the campaign has revealed the vulnerabilities of both leaders. I'm David Spears. Welcome to Insiders. As far as campaign blunders go, it was a doozy. Anthony Albanese's failure to cite the most important economic numbers dominated the opening days of the contest and rattled the nerves of many on the Labor side. The Prime Minister, by contrast, shifted easily back into campaign mode, accepting he may not be popular, but urging voters to stick with the devil they know. By the end of the week, however, it was Scott Morrison on the defensive over his captain's pick candidate, who's been forced to apologise repeatedly for offensive views on the transgender community. The policy offerings in week one were modest at best. Both sides have instead gone negative early.
No, this time, every time.
This election is a choice between a government that you know and that has been delivering and a Labor opposition that you don't.
This election will determine whether we can come together to build a better future.
Mr Albanese, Mr Albanese.
I'm not Scott Morrison. I don't run away from press conferences.
What's the national unemployment rate?
National unemployment rate at the moment is, I think it's 5.4. Sorry. I'm not sure what it is.
The unemployment rate, I'm happy to tell you, was 4%. Shadow Finance Minister, do you know what the unemployment rate is?
The unemployment rate's at 4%.
Anthony Albanese didn't know the unemployment. All right. So what? Earlier today, I made a mistake. I'm human.
But he didn't miss it by that much. He missed it by that much.
Here's a Taylor Swift comment for you. My theory is shake it off.
Still working. Falcon! Hey, Falcon, here we go, buddy. Falcon! I lead a very strong team, and it is a team that I lead. And Maurice is here and has done an outstanding job just having returned from the NATO Foreign Ministers meeting.
Today you campaign here with Foreign Minister Maurice Payne and the Treasurer Josh Frydenberg. Is it a sign that your popularity is on the nose, that you are damaged goods across Australia?
No, well, you know, it's not a popularity test. Barnaby said this the other day. You go to the dentist, doesn't matter whether you like him or not, or like her or not, but you want to know that they're good at their job.
Anthony Albanese today pledged a $135 million trial of bulk bill clinics to relieve the pressure on hospital emergency departments.
Australians won't need their wallet, they'll just need their Medicare card.
How are you possibly going to afford to build 50 of these facilities?
This has been fully costed by the Parliamentary Budget Office.
They'll kick you down, they'll tell you that you'll never be the one. You gotta know that you're the real thing.
Well, you've got to make sure you get things right, don't you?
The Prime Minister today confronting difficulties of his own with his failure to deliver an anti-corruption watchdog.
It's a broken promise, isn't it?
No, it's not.
But you promised you would establish one in the last term. You have not. That's a broken promise.
We put forward our proposal in detailed legislation, and it has not been supported by the Labor Party.
The reason why this Prime Minister doesn't want an anti-corruption commission is sitting on his front bench.
The New South Wales Treasurer, Matt Keane, has called on the Liberal candidate for Warringah to be disendorsed over comments about transgender people.
This is the Treasurer of New South Wales, Matt Keane. He is a serious player in the Liberal Party.
I don't share Matt's view. I share Tony Abbott's view. I'm not joining that pile-on.
And what's extraordinary is that Catherine Deves has been handpicked by the Prime Minister.
I'm very pleased to have women standing.
If I was Scott Morrison, I wouldn't have selected her in the first place. Thanks very much.
And my first guest this morning is the Foreign Minister, Maurice Payne. For the duration of the campaign, we'll be extending the program to 90 minutes each Sunday morning. And so I'll have a second guest a little later on this week, the Shadow Health Minister, Mark Butler. And do stay with us for Offsiders, which will still follow us at 10:30. And a big thanks to Patricia Karvelos for hosting the show last week on what turned out to be a pretty big day. First, let's see what's making news. Anne Ruston is set to replace Greg Hunt as Health Minister if the coalition's returned. The Prime Minister is set to announce the promotion for his Social Services Minister today. He'll also announce plans to provide a continuous glucose monitoring device to every Australian with type 1 diabetes. The Nine newspapers report there's dismay amongst moderate Liberals at the Prime Minister's refusal to dump the party's candidate in Warringah over her comments on the transgender community. One says she won't win the seat but will continue to take paint off the rest of them in seats they need to hold. And one from the Saturday paper, more details on what's behind the taxpayer-funded payout of more than $500,000 to Alan Tudge's former advisor, Rochelle Miller. Karen Middleton reports Ms Miller has alleged a separate Liberal MP, not Alan Tudge, sexually harassed her more than a decade ago at Parliament House, and this forms part of the negotiated settlement with the Commonwealth. Now, the first week of the campaign may not have been edifying, but it has been revealing. Scott Morrison's strategy is clear. He's chasing votes in the blue-collar and multicultural suburbs. For him, it's purely about jobs, not an integrity commission or the transgender community. This won't help Liberals in more progressive seats, but that doesn't appear to be the Prime Minister's priority. Anthony Albanese, by contrast, is going for a broader appeal, but he had a bad start, not knowing the most important economic numbers, having to clarify his border protection policy, and then correcting himself on policy costings showed a need to seriously sharpen up. Let's see what the panel makes of it. We're joined this week by Andrew Probyn, Samantha Maiden and Peter Harcher. Very good morning to all of you.
Good day, David.
So let's start with what dominated certainly the first few days of the campaign. Anthony Albanese, look, he can't be expected to carry every number in his head, but these were very important numbers. And Andrew, this really mattered.
This was a real shocker of a first blunder. In terms of campaigns, think back at 2019. What do you remember? You probably remember two things. You remember Bill Shorten in tears, and you remember a bill that no one can afford. This particular occasion, this brain explosion from Anthony Albanese is something that will potentially define this whole campaign. It was a critical number. It is a critical number. It is central to jobs. It's central to wages. It's central to cost of living.
And the budget bottom line.
And the budget bottom line. So it's, in terms of numbers, not to forget, this was unforgivable.
Well, Sam, a lot of people, a lot of critics of the media here have said, oh, this sort of pop quiz stuff shouldn't be what a campaign's about. What do you think?
Well, there's two elements to this that I think are interesting. One is, was it a brain fade? Yes. Was Anthony Albanese himself embarrassed by it? Clearly, and the party was worried about it. Now, why did he get into this position? I think that there is an aspect of the press gallery and journalists doing Anthony Albanese a disservice in the last couple of years, because they've kind of rope-a-doped him, right? They haven't actually subjected him to tougher questioning. There's perfectly legitimate reasons for that. When Parliament's sitting, the focus is on the government, right? And that's the story of the day. And the Anthony Albanese interview, unless there's an issue, is kind of not front and centre. So he hasn't been subjected to this sort of rigour. And the other thing that I think it reflects is that he has not held an economic portfolio, right? And he hasn't had that discipline. And it is very strange to me, the idea that he basically got the infrastructure portfolio in the Rudd years and he just stayed there. And after there was the leadership change after the 2013 election, he ran against Bill Shorten and won the popular vote of members, but didn't won the party membership vote. My understanding is that Bill Shorten basically gave him his pick of portfolios. And he chose to just sit there. Why? It shows a lack of ambition and that...
He really likes infrastructure.
Well, the fact that he's really only just had one portfolio is I think, emblematic of...
He should have broadened out.
...a lack of ambition and he should have taken on finance or treasury or one of these other things, or defence or something that had broadened him out, and that's why he's having those problems now.
And this, look, as I said, there are a lot of numbers that float around, but this one, this 4% unemployment number, it was one the government's been absolutely hammering now.
Literally screaming it.
Well, in fact, for weeks. Have a look.
As a government, our economic plan has meant that Australia's unemployment rate has fallen to 4%.
At 4%, Mr Speaker.
At 4%, headed to 3.75%.
4%, the equal lowest in 48 years.
Peter, pretty hard to miss.
Yeah, and if he'd missed all of that, there's also the fact that on the day that the Prime Minister called the election, in calling the election, he said it there as well. He said we have 4% unemployment. Albanese has told his colleagues that he did know the number, he'd used the number himself. He just had a mental blank, and we all have those from time to time. I think the potency of it, of course, is that it does play directly into Scott Morrison's story, that Labor is weak on the economy and can't be trusted, and it makes him look unreliable. I don't think it's determinative. I don't think it decides the election outcome.
It may decide the first week, but not necessarily the whole campaign.
It had a big impact on week one, because Labor then was defending itself and talking on the government's turf, which is the economy. I think what matters is what Albanese and Labor do next.
I mean, he looked sharper yesterday. I thought he was asked about defence spending. He had the exact number there, more precise.
But I think the key thing to say is that, is this going to decide the election? Of course not, right? It gets overblown. There'll be people at home thinking, I can't believe you're still talking about this. But, I think at the end of the day, he does need to sharpen up. But also, the media needs to apply the same rules to Scott Morrison. Scott Morrison makes mistakes too. If we get stuck into this kind of groove where we're just like, oh, Albo, where's the gaffe today, right? Well, what about Scott Morrison's gaffes? I mean, we can talk about some of that asylum seeker stuff later, but I mean, he's made some gaffes as well.
Well, let's talk about where he faced real pressure towards the end of the week, and that was over the Integrity Commission that he'd promised before the last election, hasn't been delivered. And yes, a bill was tabled but not introduced, let alone debated or voted on in the Parliament. Now, is this a broken promise? Well, he's blaming Labor, and what will he do now?
That legislation is my policy. Parliament. That's what I'm putting to the election, and that's what I would hope to put to the Parliament.
Peter, let me come to you first on this. Is it a broken promise? Is it Labor's fault that the government couldn't deliver this?
Of course it's a broken promise, and it's a really high priority, not just for the government but for the country. And if just on the politics of it, this is one of the only issues in the country which in every poll for years now has got majority support, anywhere between 60 and 90%. Coalition voters, Labor voters, it's a national priority.
Is it a vote changer though?
It could be. It could be. It is such a potent issue, especially in the so-called teal seats, the voices of seats. These are once blue ribbon Liberal seats, which are now up for grabs. These are seats like Wentworth in Sydney, North Sydney, seats in Melbourne like Kooyong, Goldstein. So the three issues that the candidates there are campaigning on, independents are campaigning on against the government, climate change, Integrity Commission and Justice for Women. Integrity Commission is one of the three central points. Now, if Scott Morrison's prepared to walk away from an Integrity Commission, that's essentially an admission that he's given up on holding those blue ribbon Liberal seats.
What is his position now? I mean, you heard him there say, we hope to...
Well, his position is it's my way or the highway.
As in, Labor needs to guarantee support before we even introduce it to Parliament.
Now, remember Bridget Archer, she said, well, let's at least have a debate. Now, she crossed the floor, not in support of anyone else's model, she crossed the floor to have a debate about a model that can be progressed through Parliament. Of course, that never got anywhere, but it just shows you that even on his side, there's a lot of pressure. Now, on Peter's point, like, can the Prime Minister seriously allow this debate to go for another 5 weeks? Because he's going to be hounded on this one. But the question is whether he is intending on pushing through against any other form of Integrity Commission model. Does he really want to sacrifice other seats because he thinks that there are others to be won? I think that that's probably fundamental to some of the political thinking here. And I don't know if we can honestly assess that just yet, but it looks like there's some element of sacrifice.
What do you think, Sam? Does it look to you like Morrison's not worrying so much about those teal seats where the independents are challenging at the moment through his position now on the Integrity Commission and on this issue of transgender community?
On the issue of the Integrity Commission, he's never wanted one. He had to be dragged kicking and screaming to do one. And the minute the opportunity arose to run up the white flag because Labor wouldn't support exactly the one that he wanted, he was Gonski and out of there and then blaming it on them. So he doesn't want to have one, and he's happy to leave it at that. Yeah, I think there is absolutely a tactic where, as you say, it's named by voters in those seats, independent seats, as one of the top three issues. And I think that there is absolutely a potential move here where he is focused on those outer suburban seats. And there's a lot of people saying that, for example, in Victoria, that McEwen is at risk. Now, that is a Labor seat on 5%, so you wouldn't necessarily look at that and think, oh, McEwen is up for grabs. Labor's putting more resources into that seat. There's a real anti-Dan Andrews thing in outer Melbourne, and that is, and like, I'm not saying it will happen, but, you could see a situation where maybe Labor does pick up Chisholm, but then they take a seat off them in McEwen and it's a zero-sum game. And that's the slim path to victory that you see, where right now, no matter what the polls say, both major political parties acknowledge there's a pathway to victory for both the parties. It's a slimmer and more perilous pathway for Scott Morrison, but it's still possible if he can pick up some of those outer suburban seats.
So at the end of week one, let's just get some quick thoughts. Has either leader managed to establish a clear theme and a clear advantage, Andrew?
Look, I think that it has been defined by a gaffe this week. I think this Easter's come at a really good time for the Labor Party in particular and Anthony Albanese, because it is there's an opportunity now for renewal. I think that Scott Morrison, the theme that's come through from this week is the economy. It really is the economy stupid. That's the theme that's come through. Don't risk change.
Yeah, Sam, has Labor established a clear theme?
Well, I don't know, it's Labor Cares or something, and isn't that what it is? I don't know. Look, Scott Morrison's a better campaigner. End of story. He's done it more often. Anthony Albanese is still finding his feet. He's never run an election before, and he's not tight enough in those press conferences. He's a bit, too waffly, and he just hasn't got his act together. Does that mean that he won't win the election? No, he can still win the election, but absolutely, Labor can still win the election. And on current settings, you'd far rather be Anthony Albanese than Scott Morrison.
Yeah, a number of senior Liberals I spoke to said, yeah, they're absolutely thrilled with how the first week has gone, but they still reckon they're behind. Leader?
Well, that's right. Albanese goes into this ahead. But if he accepts that he has now been exposed as somehow unreliable on the economy, then he could lose the election. I think it's that central. If the Labor Party goes through its mechanical campaign of the leader going to do a health theme or an education theme every day and avoiding the economy, I think Labor is walking towards defeat. I think Morrison has to accept the challenge, accept that the economy is an irreducible national responsibility in the federal sphere, and go there and try his best to win ground or at least make himself credible on the economy, as well as being, the preferred candidate for service delivery like health and education.
Yeah, because people want their kids to be able to go and see a doctor. There's no doubt about that. But the principal thing people are going to be worried about when they vote is what's going to happen to my interest rates, what's going to happen to my job, and, are my children going to be able to buy a house?
Look, the critical thing is with an election campaign is that there is two things running in tandem. One is about the contest over policy, the other is about messaging. Now, Scott Morrison is a Prime Minister who is happier campaigning than he is governing, right? Now, given that that's the overarching element of his character, on political messaging, he's much sharper. And when the policy contest is secondary, almost third actually this week, because it's been pretty light on policy, the political message becomes critical for Anthony Albanese. And with those flabby press conferences where he's not sharpening up his message, that becomes actually important. It's not facile to talk about political messaging.
Well,
it's about trying to synthesise.
So don't worry, we are going to drill into the policy offerings, modest as they were, a little later in the program as well. Time now to talk to the Minister for Foreign Affairs and Women, Marise Payne. To take us there, here was the Prime Minister refusing to dump his captain's pick candidate in the seat of Warringah, Catherine Deves, despite the New South Wales Treasurer and leading New South Wales Liberal moderate Matt Keane insisting she has to go.
Now, I don't share Matt's view. I share Tony Abbott's view. I'm not joining that pile-on. And she has learned from her experiences about how she's sought to deal with this issue in the past. And I have no doubt that she'll pursue these issues in a more sensitive way and more respectful way in the future.
Marise Payne, welcome to the program.
Good morning.
So the Prime Minister says he shares Tony Abbott's view, which is that Catherine Deves is a tough, brave person. Not the view of Matt Keane, who says, quote, there is no place for that vile bigotry in a mainstream political party. He's sick of people turning a blind eye to it. Whose view do you share?
I don't share Ms Deves' views on the comments that she has made, but importantly she has apologised. She has withdrawn those views, and as the Prime Minister said yesterday, in public life we do have to be very careful about the way we express our opinions. Most importantly, we have to exercise sensitivity and respect. And in this case, in the case of the massively complex and extremely challenging issues that accompany any individual's decisions about transition and transgender issues, overwhelmingly that has to be the approach that we take, one of sensitivity and one of respect. And that is my view, actually, mine.
Well, that's clearly not what we've heard from Catherine Deves. She's apologised for some of these remarks, but things like trans children being surgically mutilated, all men with trans identities, half of all men with trans identities being sex offenders. Do you think she should be dropped as the candidate?
Ultimately, that is a matter for the Liberal Party here in New South Wales, for the organisation.
Sorry, I need to ask you what you think.
But Ms Deves has apologised for those remarks. She has withdrawn those remarks, and that's the most important thing as she continues as the candidate there in Warringah. She has made that apology clear, but importantly, in relation to the issue that she has been discussing, I think we need to look at fairness, at safety and inclusion in terms of women in sport. This is a discussion that we should be having. It's a discussion that a number of the codes have already engaged in across Australia and internationally.
Sure.
And I think the focus that has come out of those discussions about safety and fairness and inclusion is an important one.
Sure, but let me come back to the question, Minister. You are one of the most senior figures in the New South Wales division. Do you think Catherine Deves should be dropped as the Liberal candidate?
Ms Deves is the Liberal candidate, David, and that is the premise upon which we are approaching this.
But do you think she should be dropped?
But she has withdrawn and apologised for those remarks.
But do you think she should be dropped as the candidate, is the question?
David, she is the Liberal candidate and she's withdrawn and apologised for those remarks.
But should she be dropped?
David, it's a matter for the organisation in New South Wales. I need to get on with my job. That's what I'm doing. And I don't agree with the remarks that she made. I've made that explicitly clear. I do agree that there needs to be a discussion in relation to the participation of transgender people in sport. And that is one that is based on, as I said,
and we heard that
fairness and inclusion.
Let me just ask you, at the last election, the Liberals did drop a candidate in the seat of Lyons in Tasmania for offensive social media posts. They were anti-Muslim posts. The Prime Minister said at the time, these posts weren't disclosed to the Liberal Party. If you're not straight with the party reserves its right to disendorse. What's the difference here?
Well, the Prime Minister said in that case the party reserves its right to disendorse. We always do have that right. But in this case, the statements have been the subject of an apology and a withdrawal, and I think that is a difference between the example that you've provided there before.
Is this a good example of why pre-selection would be a better way to go to ventilate these social media histories rather than a captain's pick?
Well, having just been through a very robust pre-selection of my own in the company of over 550 of the Liberal Party's members in New South Wales, I'm a strong supporter of the pre-selection process. But
Should it have happened here?
Ultimately, in this case and a number of other cases, decisions were made to nominate candidates through a subcommittee process. That has been done. Those candidates are in the field. Is that a good idea? Some of them are fabulous candidates, and I look forward to working with them.
Was it a good way to go?
Well, ultimately, David, they're matters for the organisation.
What do you think, Maurice Payne?
And I'm looking forward, not backwards, David.
What's your view, Maurice Payne?
Well, we have great candidates on the ground. Maria Kovacic, who was there with the Prime Minister and with me in Parramatta last week, was also chosen in that same way.
Okay.
She's doing a fabulous job, and I'm looking forward to working with them all.
Now, Alan Tudge's former advisor, Rochelle Miller, has waived any confidentiality clause over her settlement payout. Can the government now be transparent with taxpayers as to why she's apparently receiving a payout of more than $500,000?
David, I don't know. I have no awareness of the details of these matters, and it's not appropriate for me to have that awareness. As I understand it, the way these are handled by the Department of Finance, and specifically through the Comcare process, it is a matter that is handled between individuals and the department itself. It's not something that involves ministers at all. Ultimately, these are matters for the Finance Department and for Comcare as the agency. If there is a process underway, then I'm sure that it is being pursued in the appropriate way that these matters are handled traditionally and typically through that arm's length process from ministers.
Well, I mentioned earlier, Karen Middleton reporting in the Saturday paper that the settlement relates to an historical allegation of sexual harassment involving another Liberal MP, not Alan Tudge. And apparently this MP is still in Parliament. Have you heard anything about this? Do you have any knowledge of this?
None whatsoever, David. And in terms of it being the subject of, if it is, a Comcare claim, then I would not expect to have that knowledge.
Should taxpayers know, though? Should taxpayers be told if a Liberal MP has done something wrong that requires this level of taxpayer-funded settlement? Don't we deserve to know?
Well, I think that the process that exists in terms of the Comcare process is about enabling applicants, in this case Ms Miller, to seek support from the system if they feel that they have been treated inappropriately. There are a number of structures around that, both legal and professional. It is not something that I have been involved with in this particular case at all, and as I said, I have no awareness whatsoever of the other allegation that you've raised this morning.
Let's turn to the economy. The Prime Minister's been campaigning squarely on jobs. You've been with him this week as well. Is it really surprising unemployment is so low, given how much the government's pumped into the economy, record low interest rates as well?
Well, I think it would be a big mistake to assume these things just happen. They happen because we've worked very hard, and the Australian people have worked very hard to ensure that coming out of the other side of the worst of the COVID-19 pandemic, that we have the strong economy that we do. Unemployment at 4%, women's unemployment at 3.7%, the lowest rate since, in fact, the 1970s. A participation rate of women of 62.4%. 4%. That's higher than the 58.7% we inherited from Labor when we were elected. But it doesn't happen by accident. It happens because, as a government and with the Australian people, particularly with business, particularly with those people who have sought and found employment, we have been able to pursue a very strong economic plan. That's the difference between this government and the opposition.
Speaking
we
of
have a strong economic plan.
Government spending, ministers have been busy in marginal seats this week, promising lots of local projects. You were announcing one in the seat of Macquarie. I think it was a local footy oval. What's the process around how you spend this money? Do you know?
Well, the process is that through the departments through which the allocations are made, whether they're community building grants or whatever that they may be, they are distributed through that department, they are managed through that department. In this case, they are delivered by local councils, and the delivery partner for this project in the Blue Mountains is the Blue Mountains City Council. They are already the delivery partner for a number of other projects that we have committed to. We have recently seen the All Abilities Inclusive Playground, for example, in Blaxland, delivered through exactly the same way. The Council and the Commonwealth Government, the relevant department, are engaged in the redevelopment of the Knapsack Park sports facilities, which are used by thousands and thousands of locals every weekend, weather permitting at the moment. Thousands and thousands of locals. It makes it safer for them. It makes it more inclusive and more open for those participants, and so will the development at Glenbrook Oval.
Let me ask you about the National Integrity Commission. Can you just clear up for us, what is the coalition promising at this election?
We have a detailed piece of legislation, David. It's been broadly consulted. It's over 300 pages in detail. It provides our framework for a Commonwealth Integrity Commission. It has been tabled in the Parliament. It is there for all to see. What we have from the opposition is a 2-page summary, and that's all they've had.
Let's stick to your plan. So you tabled it, didn't introduce it to Parliament, didn't debate it, certainly didn't have a vote on it. What's the promise now? Would you do that?
The promise is to proceed with that legislation, David, because that is our commitment. It's what the Prime Minister said yesterday. It's clearly there for all to see.
But the problem with that model, as you'd know, is that it doesn't allow for any public hearings if politicians are involved, won't receive any public tip-offs, won't issue any public findings of corruption. It's a weak model, isn't it?
No, I don't agree. It's a well-consulted model. It has powers equivalent to a Royal Commission in terms of its investigative powers. It has powers to investigate prior acts. And importantly, it follows the rule of law. And importantly, it seeks to avoid the prejudgment that we have frankly seen in other anti-corruption commissions around Australia, which have resulted in I think many people would agree, less than ideal outcomes.
Like what?
Well, I think the example of prejudging a person's reputation before they have the opportunity to even make their own case, David, is not the sort of thing that I think is necessarily...
Are you referring to Gladys Berejiklian?
Well, that would be one example, yes.
Well, are you saying that voters shouldn't have been told about grants that she approved for her then boyfriend's electorate?
No, David, I'm not saying voters should not have been told. I'm saying that the way anti-corruption commissions operate, I think should actually follow some semblance of the rule of law, some semblance of innocent until proven guilty. And I think in some cases they have not.
Are you reflecting there, though, on the ICAC Chief Commissioner? He's a former Supreme Court judge. Are you saying he prejudged Gladys Berejiklian?
I make no reflection whatsoever on any individual or any decision. And in fact, I'm speaking broadly about anti-corruption commissions as they exist at state level. And one of the things that we have done in the consultation process on this draft bill of 300 pages, David, which, by the way, has $100 million allocated to it in the budget. It is fully funded in the budget. That is our commitment to proceed with that legislation as it stands. And the Labor Party, frankly, would need to be asked if we are re-elected, if we have the opportunity to proceed with that legislation, whether they would consider that a mandate and whether they would support that.
Let me turn to your portfolio. Australia has been politely asking the Solomon Islands not to sign this draft security agreement with China. Prime Minister Sogavare says he's still planning to go ahead with it. He says it won't involve a military base. Do you believe him?
I think they're very important assurances, David, and they're certainly assurances that we have sought, as well as my discussions with Foreign Minister Manelli, the Prime Minister's correspondence with Prime Minister Sogavare, and of course Minister Saselja's discussions. We've been engaged in bilateral security work with the Solomon Islands for a long time. It's under the bilateral security treaty between the Solomon Islands and Australia that the assistance force, made up of Pacific family countries, Australia, New Zealand, Fiji and Papua New Guinea, went to the Solomon Islands at the end of last year to support them in dealing with the unrest that occurred at that time. Overwhelmingly, we believe that the Pacific family is best placed as responders to security issues in the Pacific region.
You mentioned that security cooperation. Would that continue if the Solomon Islands sign this agreement with China?
Yes, that is absolutely my view, and it is the view of Pacific partners. But there is also a concern that there has been a lack of transparency in relation to this agreement, and that it's something that should be discussed in the broader Pacific Island Forum context itself. Australia would support that discussion. Other countries have called for it as well.
On Ukraine, US President Joe Biden's accused Russia of genocide. Ukraine's parliament's also passed a resolution accusing Russia of genocide. The French president says he's reluctant to use that word. What about you?
From Australia's perspective, and we've discussed this in the context of other appalling events, from Australia's perspective, by and large, we operate within decisions by courts in relation to the declaration of a genocide. That's the approach that we have consistently taken, and why we are so strongly supporting the work of the International Criminal Court, including through the reference in early March to the International Criminal Court of these appalling events in Ukraine by Russia. That enabled investigations to begin at that time. That enables the preservation of evidence and the taking of evidence and statements in the context of the investigations of the court. We are also providing two officials to work with the court in their investigations, and I think that there is room for us to also provide support potentially through the Australian Federal Police and their significant experience in a number of these issues, particularly related to MH17.
A final one. There are still about 40 Australian children and their mothers stuck in a refugee camp in northeast Syria since the fall of ISIS. UN agencies have been calling for countries to take them home, the US as well. If you're re-elected, will Australia do more to bring home these Australian citizens?
David, we did everything we could to dissuade and prevent Australians from travelling to that zone in the first place. And unfortunately, a number still chose to do that, both women and men. And there are, of course, as you say, a number of children who are with largely their mothers at this stage, still in that zone. What we have to take into account is the safety of all Australians, including here domestically. And these are matters that we continue to discuss within the government and certainly through my department and with the Department of Home Affairs.
So right now they're considered to pose a risk? Is that the issue? Right now they're considered to pose a risk?
We have to be very clear about these matters for the protection of all Australians, and that includes here. I wouldn't go into the specifics of any intelligence, of course, but ultimately they are Australians who have found themselves in this position because their parents took themselves to those war zones.
Foreign Minister Marise Payne, we'll have to leave it there. Thanks very much for joining us.
Thank you, David.
Well, let's return to our panel. We're joined once again by Andrew Probyn, Samantha Maiden, Peter Harcher. I want to come back to this Catherine Deves issue, the Liberal candidate in Warringah. Well, just firstly on that, Sam, do you think Marise Payne is entirely comfortable with her remaining the candidate?
Clearly not. I mean, she told us everything we need to know with her inability to answer that question. I mean, that was not a full-bodied, full-throated defence of Catherine Deves at all.
What's going on in the Liberal division in New South Wales at the moment on this very issue, Andrew?
Well, it continues to be a shambles, doesn't it? This goes back years and months, the division over pre-selection we saw. In fact, this is a result of this spat between the various factions of the New South Wales Liberals. It's quite clear that inside the New South Wales Liberal division, the moderates are trying to get her out, get her disendorsed, because they see the damage being in other seats like North Sydney, seats like Wentworth. So I think Marie's pain there, that was terribly uncomfortable.
But let's recap briefly. I mean, what's happening in the New South Wales Liberal Party is extraordinary, because the New South Wales Treasurer came out on Friday night and demanded that the Prime Minister dump this woman. I mean, when does that happen during an election?
And I think, Sam, right? He was speaking on behalf of others.
Right, who may, and there may be more to come. And we've also seen those leaked emails from Walter Villatoro that, like, they're completely at war, right?
But, Peter, they can't dump her now that the PM yesterday went so far out and, he dug in. He said, we got to stick with her. I'm not going to join this pile-on.
That's right.
It'd be humiliating to dump her now.
In which case, the standoff continues and the factional dispute goes on even further into an election campaign. This is a stunning piece of political amateurishness and bloody-mindedness. This started as the two non-Morrison factions in the New South Wales Liberal division getting together to frustrate the Morrison faction's choices of candidates. Morrison refusing to accept loss at that level, insisting on choosing his own candidates, spilling now right into an actual campaign where you just saw in your interview the Foreign Minister, one of the most senior ministers in the government, refusing to endorse a Liberal candidate.
But the other thing about Catherine
This is an extraordinary piece of ham-fistedness, and it just rolls on.
The other thing, I think the crucial point about Catherine Deves, though, is this, right? It's not like they have been surprised.
Yes, tell us who Catherine Deves is. Tell us a bit about Catherine Deves.
Well, I mean, Catherine Deves is a very articulate, very photogenic, very passionate person, arguing that essentially Australian netball teams are going to be overrun by a rampaging army of 6-foot hairy men in dresses, right? This is the idea, right? And we're laughing, but, it is obviously very painful for the trans community, right? I mean, look, I am not convinced that this is such a problem as they are being suggested, right? You get the odd trans kid in a school. By and large, schools these days tend to deal with it quite sensitively. But this idea that, you'll be going down to the netball court and there'll be a man in a dress shouting, "Goal attack!" right, or shoulder charging you or something. I mean, I'm not convinced that it's the problem they're all saying, right? But Catherine Deves is, she's obviously impressive, right, in some of these, in sort of
but this is her thing, right? This is her issue.
This is her issue.
It's not a surprise that she has...
right? Like, it's not a surprise. It's not like... And the Prime Minister has picked her, right, out of nowhere. This woman was not a member of the Liberal Party until 6 months before. She had to get... When she first put up her nomination, they basically said, bugger off, because you're meant to be a member for a year. And the Prime Minister's gone, oh, no, we'll give you an exemption. Why? Because he wants to talk about this issue.
Yeah,
why?
Exactly.
Because he thinks it's going to help him in outer suburban suburbs like McEwen we were talking about before. This is not an accident, right? So, of course, he can't disendorse her. And, particularly after Matt Keane spoke out, because he can't stand Matt Keane. That'd be like surrendering.
So,
to the
David,
Russians.
I think Sam's just pointed out what's going on here. She's been picked not to win Warringah, but for the Prime Minister to attempt to win elsewhere.
Yeah, where there are stronger views on these issues.
Yeah, and last night, I mean, Christy Miller, who is one of the better-known campaigners for trans rights in Australia, she put up a social media video in tears after she discovered that she personally and 2 other women were named in one of these Catherine Deves videos, suggesting that women should be frightened of them if they saw them in toilets. I mean, that is really distressing and personal. She's not saying, she's naming people. She's saying, oh, we're not talking about the friendly face of the young trans children. I mean, this is a very ugly debate.
So what will happen now, Andrew? I suspect Catherine Deves now goes quiet, runs dead. They're not going to win Warringah. And, you know, hope that this doesn't continue causing problems for the leader and others in those more moderate progressive seats. What do you think?
Well, it is the tactic here to win those outer suburban seats. So just like we had discussion about the Integrity Commission, the Prime Minister has these firm views. What's undeclared is what his target is. It's the people in the outer suburbs who might have some residual sympathy for the views expressed by Catherine Deves. Is a bit of a wink, wink, nudge, nudge situation that puts Maurice Payne in that terribly awkward situation. You're going to continue to have the moderates furious that they are being sacrificed potentially in inner city suburban seats.
The moderates I've spoken to don't think they're being sacrificed, but they sure aren't happy with what's going on.
Well, it's back to those teal seats, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. Look, let's turn to Alan Tudge and his former advisor Rochelle Miller. And Sam, you broke this story in news.com.au about the settlement payout, which, well, you can tell us, it's not a done deal quite yet?
So it's basically in the final stages of negotiation, and it's not $500,000; it's over $500,000,
which is a big sum. Right, in corporate or government payouts, right?
Yeah, and there's basically legal fees on top of that. So, I mean, when you add in, you know, the Vivienne Thom report and other bits and pieces, you know, I think it could easily approach the total cost the government has spent on this matter could approach $1 million.
OK, and then, as I mentioned, the Saturday paper, Karen Middleton, reporting that part of this isn't so much Alan Tudge, but another Liberal MP
and more. And more. It's not just Alan Tudge. There's the other Liberal MP. I understand there's other people involved, bureaucrats, or I should say Liberal staffers, who were in other roles. They've been named in this 40-page statement.
Is it clear whether any of these allegations have been tested, investigated, looked into, or how does it work?
I think the crucial thing here is that we don't know the full story, right? And I think people need to be clear on that. I mean, sometimes I think people have a bit of a reading comprehension issue with this story, because she made it very clear right from the beginning when she went on Four Corners and later, late last year when she gave that press conference, that she was talking about the entire arc of her experience at Parliament House, right? So she worked at Parliament House for 10 years. She worked with Michaela Cash. She accused Michaela Cash of bullying her. Michaela Cash strenuously denied that. She accused Alan Tudge of bullying her. Alan Tudge strenuously denied that. And we should say that not one but two inquiries that have been held that she didn't, Michelle Miller did not participate on legal advice, have found no evidence of wrongdoing insofar as Alan Tudge is concerned. Obviously, her lawyers have made the point she didn't participate in those. And even Vivienne Thom, the Prime Minister, likes to say that Alan Tudge has been cleared. Well, that is not what the report says. What the report says is on the balance of probabilities that a finding of wrongdoing cannot be made.
Yeah, so
right?
everyone...
But do you see my point is that we're talking about Michaela Cash.
It's a long period of time.
But we don't know whether the settlement doesn't say, 20% is this, 40% of that.
No.
But I think it's a reasonable question to say to the Prime Minister, what is this money for? He needs to explain that.
Well, this is the thing, Peter, and, you know, Maurice Payne, it's not her portfolio, but no one in the government can tell us what the payment's for, or indeed what the process is involved. Has this been looked into by officials in coming up with this rather large settlement payout?
Yeah. Well, I think there are two public governance issues involved here. One is Alan Tudge, the Prime Minister tells us, has been stood aside as a minister, yet remains in his cabinet, and if they win the election, would be expected to return to the front bench as a minister. So does this negotiation settlement contain questions or answers about his ministerial conduct that is relevant to whether he should be a minister? Has the code of conduct been breached? Have there been other questions or findings against him or other ministers? And if so, we need to know what they are. And the second public policy or governance point here, I think, is at some point when the negotiation is finished and the settlement is done, an accounting to the public of why $500,000 or more in public funds has been spent.
I want to come back to this. I want to check in, though, right now with Casey Briggs, who's been crunching the numbers each week to give us a better understanding of what's going on in the campaign. Casey, very good morning to you. First, tell us, where have the leaders been in week one?
Morning, David. Well, the first week of the campaign has really been fought in just one part of the country. This bit here, Tasmania and Sydney and the Central Coast, getting most of the visits from leaders. Some stopovers in Melbourne as well. The Prime Minister actually has visited about as many Labor seats for media events as he has visited Liberal seats. So this is a man who, at least for the first week of the campaign, has been on the offensive. And Anthony Albanese became the first leader to enter Queensland during the campaign proper, first in the seat of Hinkler, then yesterday in the seat of Leichhardt. I suspect Queensland will get a bit more love this week, given there's a leaders' debate happening in Brisbane in a few days' time. But the single media event that generated the most commentary is, of course, that one on the first morning of the campaign in Launceston, when Anthony Albanese gave his opponents on day one of the campaign precisely what they wanted, and setting the tone for much of that first week.
Well, Casey, just on that gaffe on unemployment, you've also taken a look at what impact that had.
Yeah, so let's just set aside any debate about, you know, how big a deal this gaffe was on employment. I just want to look at how it's been propagated through the week, because we know that this is an issue that got a lot of newspaper inches, it got a lot of broadcast minutes through the week. Let's just look to the data. These figures from Stream track radio, print and TV stories and the number of them that mention each party leader each day. And you can see the Prime Minister and the opposition leader kind of on share of voice this week, roughly tracking each other fairly closely. A big drop-off on Friday. That is, of course, Good Friday, a much quieter day on the trail. But when you look at the topics that are being covered in this first week, you can see pretty quickly that this is a week that has really been fought on the topics that the government, the Liberals, want to be talking about. Employment was the biggest, most covered election issue of the week. That's Tuesday, the day of the gaffe, and the day afterward, 5,800 stories. The gaffe industrial complex has really wound down in the last few weeks, and by the end of the week, last few days, I should say, and by the end of the week, we were seeing a more substantive contest of ideas on a wider range of topics, and Labor would be at least thankful that health was one of the top few campaign issues being covered in the back half of this week. We've also got this other issue now of integrity and corruption being discussed a bit more. That is obviously another topic Labor's very happy to talk about. Also the independents in those inner city seats. We'll see if this becomes more of a campaign issue covered in the media in the days and weeks to come. But it's no doubt this employment gaffe was something that the Liberal Party saw as a weakness and wanted to exploit, and by Jove they did. When 3 years ago the government successfully really defined Bill Shorten in voters' eyes. That was the conclusion of Labor's internal review of that particular campaign, basically concluding, among other things, that that sustained campaign of attacks by the coalition on Bill Shorten's credibility had an impact and took its toll by the end of the campaign. And this time around, we've seen Labor trying to do the reverse. That's what all this kind of stuff is about, defining Scott Morrison in voters' eyes on Labor's terms. And we've seen this week the coalition's counterattack move into hyperdrive. The first ads on Monday morning after that economic gaffe were out within hours. Don't risk our economy with Labor, says the Liberal Party of Australia account. We've actually done an audit of all of the Facebook ads bought by that were active on the Liberal Party of Australia's account in the 5 days leading up to Thursday. A bit over 100 of them in total, and more than half of them are about Labor. In fact, the Liberal Party of Australia account spent more money on ads attacking Labor on issues like the economy and employment than ads promoting its own record of government. What's a bit unknown here is the big picture. Will this sustained attack on Labor make much of a difference for voters? We don't have any national polls that have been published this week that were fielded during the campaign proper. We've had 2 polls at the start of the week, a News poll and a Roy Morgan poll. They were both fielded before the campaign began, and David, neither of them made any real measurable difference to our national polling average.
And Casey, just back on the Liberal Party attack ads on Labor that you talk about there on Facebook, are they all about the same thing?
So Party Central, at least, Liberal Party of Australia, the sort of central main account, is extremely on message when it comes to, you know, their key line. Don't trust the other guys, trust us when it comes to the economy. There are a few other little messages that are popping up, and I want to share one of them with you. That's this one. The Liberal Party of Australia in the last few weeks have run a series of ads on what they're calling Labor's retiree tax. Now, this is, a tax that I'm sure the opposition would say doesn't exist. They don't have a retiree tax. But these are ads that are imploring people to sign a petition. At the bottom, it says, sign the petition against Labor's retiree tax. There's a sign-up button down there that you would think takes you to a website with a link to, sign that petition. Curiously, that link is actually dead. It doesn't go anywhere, so that's a bit curious. And this ad, we should say, hasn't had a lot of money spent on it, just a few $100s. It's been seen by more than 55,000 people, though, targeted mostly at people aged over 55, particularly in New South Wales and in Queensland. I asked the Coalition campaign what this ad's about and what they're referring to when they talk about Labor's retiree tax. They haven't got back to me. So what's this all about, David? Is this some message testing that means we're, potentially going to see in the coming weeks more of an attack on this particular topic of a retiree tax? It's worth probably also noting, David, that the federal government, the Liberal Party, have just brought up ads on television, and which, among other things, attack Anthony Albanese on his comments on this issue in the past. So I don't know, David, is this about to become a rich vein of material for the Coalition's campaign in the weeks ahead?
Terrific stuff. Casey, thank you. Let's try and answer that question. A scare campaign is what it is, Andrew.
Oh, that's absolutely fascinating. But it does show you that a lot of people who are the target audience for campaigns are not people who actually watch shows like this. They don't give a stuff about politics normally. It's the 20 to 30% of people who might be undecided right up until the next week.
And that's why it's fascinating. Casey's looking right into
exactly
where the social media spending is going from the parties, who they're targeting, what message they're sending.
But also it just shows you that fibs are going to be part of this campaign. It also shows you the point that I was trying to make earlier, that political messaging is so key. This is why Anthony Albanese has to really, really sharpen up, because the political message is the things that get through. Only a few things in this whole campaign will actually get through to voters, to households. And if this retiree tax fib gets going, then he's going to have to start, working out ways to counter it.
Yeah, and look, Labor's previously, before the campaign began, I know, run material that you would also put in the scare campaign category about the cashless welfare card and pensioners being put on it and so on. But, we need to keep an eye on what's going on in this space. Back on to what Casey was saying about where they've gone. What do you read into the travels of the two leaders so far, Peter?
Remarkable that the Prime Minister, leader of the Liberal Party, doesn't go into Liberal heartland seats, the teal seats that are now under attack. These are the seats where the Liberal Party has, or traditionally has had, a 20% plus margin.
He paid a brief visit to Josh Frydenberg's seat.
Briefly.
I don't think we'll see a lot of him in these seats.
I don't think so, because he's a walking, talking liability for the Liberal candidates in those seats. And so that's pretty remarkable. So we see the Liberal Party in the process of surrendering its heartland to pursue the political periphery, the point that Sam was making earlier. This is a remarkable event, and going, therefore, fairly offensively into Labor-held territory. I mean, as in being on the offence, to try to take marginal seats away from the Labor Party in anticipation that they're going to be losing some of their heartland.
Well, time to talk to our second guest this morning, the Shadow Health Minister, Mark Butler. To take us there, here was the President of the Australian Medical Association, Omar Khorshid, on Labor's main policy announcement of the week, a plan to fund 50 GP urgent care clinics.
If it would actually take pressure off the hospitals and make a difference to what we describe as a logjam, then of course we'd be keen supporters. But the reality is that although these will be popular where people have access to them, and there will only be 50 of them around the country initially, which is, when you compare with the 8,000 general practices, it's a tiny drop in the ocean.
Mark Butler, welcome to the program.
Morning, David.
So the Australian, and to you, the Australian Medical Association has called this policy barely coherent. One of their biggest concerns is if you have government subsidised clinics, they'll be competing unfairly with other GP practices who will then struggle to keep their doors open after hours. What's your response to that?
We're very confident this policy will make a real difference to local communities. It will make it easier to see a doctor, particularly for those minor emergencies where families are spending hours and hours lining up in a hospital emergency department, and also by extension take real pressure off our hospitals, which are heaving under unprecedented levels of demand through this pandemic. We know it's never been harder to see a doctor. It's never been more expensive to see a doctor. And we need that intermediate level of care between a standard general practice and a hospital emergency department. When your kid falls off their skateboard and busts their arm, or you have a very deep cut that needs stitching. Currently, people can't get into a GP, particularly after hours, and they spend hours and hours instead in hospital emergency departments that were built for once-in-a-lifetime emergencies like heart attacks and strokes and car accidents, not these emergencies that could be quite adequately dealt with outside in the community if only that service were available.
But just back to that question and the concern from the AMA, tell us how this works. If you have one GP practice gets a couple of $1 million from the government, the others in that suburb are saying, hang on, this is unfair. How does that work? What happens to their business?
Well, this will be a competitive process overseen by the department. We'll identify particular regions where we know there's huge pressure on hospital emergency departments, population growth and the like. And GP practices who want to take their practice to the next level will be able to apply for the additional funding that we know is necessary to make these services viable. The service will be open 7 days a week, fully bulk billed, so no co-contribution or gap fee at all.
Just on that, is that for everybody who walks through the doors of that practice all day long? They'll all be bulk billed at that. They will have to be bulk billed at that practice?
No, this will be a service particularly targeted at minor emergencies. So there'll be a triage process, and we'll talk to state governments about this, to primary health network organisations. So it'll depend on the nature of injury as to whether it's bulk billed or not. If you've got a broken arm, it's bulk billed. If you've got a broken finger, maybe not. Well, these are decisions that we're taking clinically. Obviously, there's a lot of engagement that will need to take place with local state departments, but also PHNs to make sure we get this model right. But we've seen overseas, this model has a really serious impact in making it easier to see a doctor and taking pressure off hospital emergency departments. We've seen it in the US, the UK, and probably most importantly, the New Zealand model, which is probably the most advanced. There, they have the lowest level of emergency department presentation in the entire developed world, really taking pressure off hospitals that we know here in Australia are heaving under unprecedented demand, and allowing a family to take their kid that's fallen off a skateboard to the local doctor, get the care that they need free of charge when they need it, instead of spending hours lined up in the hospitals.
Just from what you've said, they won't know if it's free of charge till they get there, right?
Well, we intend to publicise this policy very widely. We know this is the sort of policy that patients want. In the days since the announcement, I've been contacted by a number of different GP organisations that I've been speaking to over the last several months. They want to take their practice to the next level.
Yes,
they
I'm just trying to get
there's
to the
a level
detail
of
here.
demand for
The
that.
question was, will a family know they're going to be bulk billed if their kid's fallen off the skateboard, to use your example? Will that be clear, or will they only find out when they turn up?
Well, we'd hope, of course, that people understand that this service is available in their community. We want to do everything we possibly can to publicise.
Will they get bulk billed, though?
Sorry?
Will they be bulk billed?
Yes. The condition of this funding would be the service is open 7 days a week. It's open from at least 8 a.m. to 10 p.m, where we know the vast bulk of these minor emergencies take place, and it is fully bulk billed.
But it depends on the nature of the injury whether they're bulk billed.
Well, this is a service being set up for urgent care. I mean, there is GP practices in place for your standard consultation. There are hospitals in place to deal with those once-in-a-lifetime emergencies I talked about. This is the missing middle in Australia. We see it operate really well in other countries. We want to expand Medicare. We want to make it easier to see a doctor when these sorts of things inevitably arise in households so that people get the care when and where they need it, and instead of spending hours in already overcrowded hospital emergency departments.
One of the other issues with this policy is finding more GPs when there's already a shortage, GPs and nurses. Your colleague Claire O'Neill was asked whether nurses would be brought in from overseas. She said no, no, no. Will they?
Well, for this and for aged care, we're confident that a vote of confidence in the aged care system, and we've made that in the budget reply, a vote of confidence in the Medicare system, which we're making through this urgent care announcement, will tell nurses, will tell GPs, this is an exciting, innovative place to work. What we've seen over the last 10 years...
Will they be brought in from overseas? Sorry to come back to the question. Will they be brought in from overseas?
Well, no, I don't think they will be. I think we'll be very clear that the Australian GPs will want to work in this type of practice. I've been inundated by general practice organisations calling our office, emailing us in the last several days saying they want to be a part of this. They know local GPs will want to work in this type of practice. It's exciting, it's interesting work, and they know it'll make a real difference to their local communities. It's the sort of vote of confidence in general practice you haven't got from this government that's just had cuts and neglect in general practice for the last 10 years, running down the system instead of expanding.
So you're confident you can find these GPs and nurses. When would these 50 clinics be up and running?
Well, if we're elected, we'll have them up and running next year. We want to see them up and running in the next financial year, commencing 1st of July 2023.
All 50?
Yes.
There was confusion too about whether the policy's been costed or not. Anthony Albanese said it was fully costed by the Parliamentary Budget Office, then admitted that it wasn't. Two questions. Why the confusion, and why aren't you using the Parliamentary Budget Office?
Well, this policy has been fully costed. It's been informed by work of the Parliamentary Budget Office, but the key consultation about the cost has been with general practices who understand what additional funding they need to make this model work. A lot of GP organisations have been trying to do this, but they've found that the existing Medicare funding arrangements, which are really modelled around standard general practice, simply don't make the model viable. So I've worked with them very closely. I'm confident the funding that we've allocated, capped funding, fully costed, will be sufficient to make sure these 50 practices
deliver
the care.
That's what I'm asking about. So who's done the costing?
Well, it's costing based on organisations that we've been talking to that do this work, who understand this business intimately.
Who's that?
Now, all of our costings will be fully released in the usual way through the course of this campaign by Katie Gallagher and Jim Chalmers. There'll be no difference between the way in which the Labor Party releases their costings and the Liberal Party. There will be no difference between this election and the last election or the election before it. It's all going to be very standard, David.
All right, and the same applies with your aged care policy that was announced in the budget reply. Has that been costed by the Parliamentary Budget Office?
That's fully costed. It will be released in exactly the same way as all of our policies and, frankly, all of the coalition policies as well.
Just not by the Parliamentary Budget Office?
Well, David, our costings will be released in exactly the same way they always have been in these election campaigns, and in exactly the same way the coalition's policies, including policies they've announced today, their costings, I'm confident, will be released in exactly the same way that the Labor parties will be.
Just a couple of other things. Labor's promised a National Integrity Commission would happen by the end of the year if you win. Will it look at pork barrelling as well as corruption?
Look, we're very clear that we want to clean up the rorts. 3.5 years after the promise from the Prime Minister, hundreds of millions of dollars of taxpayers' money spent as if it's Liberal Party funds, it's clear enough is enough, and the only way you get to end those rorts is changing the government, because the government itself has walked away from this. Now, I see a whole lot of Liberal MPs in the paper today saying it's not a big deal. Well, that's not the feedback we get. The feedback we get is Australians are sick of the rorts. They're sick of their money being spent as if it's Liberal Party money, and we're committed to making sure there's a tough cop on the beat that will clean up these rorts, that can act independently, not on the approval of the government of the day, that can look backwards, so undertake retrospective investigations, and can have public hearings when the Commission independently thinks that's in the public interest.
So you did talk earlier, when we were talking about your plan for GP urgent clinics, about a proper process. The department would look at regions that really need them. Anthony Albanese has already announced one in the marginal seat of Hunter. Your Labor MP in Lyons has announced there'll be 3 in Tasmania, marginal seats there. Have they gone through a proper bidding process?
We've analysed the hospital emergency department data across the country. The Hunter Valley has some of the worst waiting times at emergency departments in New South Wales. That's a very clear area of need. So we're identifying broad areas of need. We're identifying broad areas of need. They will run through the whole country, urban and regional, Liberal Party held seats, independent seats, Labor Party seats, because they will be targeted at areas of need. And then in that broader region that we identify, the department will have some discussions with local PHNs, the primary health networks that understand how these local services operate, and undertake a fully competitive process so that GP practices or community health centres in some states can bid for these services and start making it easier to see a doctor. Start taking pressure off these hospital emergency departments.
Final one, Mark Butler is a leading figure in Labor's left. Are you comfortable with the decision not to increase job seeker for people living below the poverty line, but still back the stage 3 tax cuts, which will deliver tax breaks of more than $9,000 to high-income earners?
Well, we argued very strongly for the $50 a fortnight increase that was made temporarily by the government during the pandemic to be made.
So it wasn't enough.
We understood that that was an important measure to improve the living standards of this cohort in the community. We think that was an important measure. We're also focused on a range of other things that will make a real difference to those households in the areas of social housing, access to vocational training and the like.
All right, Mark Butler, we'll have to leave it there. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks, David.
All right, let's get back to the panel again. Andrew Probyn, Sam Maiden, Peter Harcher. Sam, let's talk about policies. That was Labor's main offering during the week. GP urgent care clinics, $135 million over 4 years. What did you make of the policy?
Well, I'd be impressed if they can get them all up and running in a year.
Yeah, 50...
That might come back to haunt him.
50 clinics. Well, finding the GPs and the nurses is the challenge here, Peter.
Yeah, this is more a set of talking points for a campaign than an actual policy, because even if, as Mark Butler just told us, GPs are clamouring to work in these clinics that Labor is promising to set up, then where are they coming from? We know that across the system, as he has himself been saying, there's a shortage of GPs, so they're going to...
And you can't snap your finger and get
you can't just create
bunch
them.
of GPs.
You just can't make a new GP overnight. So without addressing the shortage of doctors in the country, this doesn't improve outcomes. As the AMA itself has said, how do you staff these? And if these are going to be staffed, where are the doctors coming from?
It's one of those ideas that sounds great, but the implementation's tougher.
Yeah.
Like, remember when Kim Beazley was always going to co-locate childcare centres and schools?
And the dreaded double drop-offs.
And then Kevin Rudd, you know, had GP super clinics and that didn't work out.
Well, this is simpler than this is simpler than the GP super clinics, of course, because they're not building a whole new facility, but it has its problems.
But this creates the issue that I was talking about there with the other GP practices in the local suburb. Be a bit miffed if one of them gets, you know, $2.7 million for one of these things.
And that is still, it's not answered, is it? I mean, if you do come in with a minor ailment, you're going to be disappointed at the front desk.
Can I just throw in that Labor doesn't have a monopoly on these junky policy announcements? The Prime Minister's big announcement on jobs this week.
Well, let's talk about that.
Million.
So he's announced, and this had a bit of a familiar echo to it, he's announced 1.3 million jobs will be created over the next 5 years, Peter.
Yes, and he's called it a pledge that they're going to deliver. Now, you know, that's interesting. However, as any number of economists has pointed out, it's just a continuation of the status quo growth trends. It doesn't represent, there's no new policy attached to it. There are no new measures involved. This is just coasting on the status quo. So that's pretty junky too.
He also, on that, he talked about, he was questioned about skilled migration. Right, now, skilled migration is clearly going to be a big function of that economic growth. He said this week that it was not going to be changing beyond 160,000. And now that's interesting because there's a lot of people saying it's going to have to be a lot more. Economists are saying it's got to be, you know, pushing over 200. And if you're looking at trying to find the GPs, if you're looking at trying to find the aged care workers, and Labor is saying we're going to need tens of thousands in the next few years, that's going to be largely skilled migration.
He did have a couple of modest announcements, the PM forestry jobs and money for oil refineries and so on. Is this going to be the pattern, these sort of targeted, smallish announcements from the PM?
Well, it's interesting, right, because the Prime Minister's position is essentially don't vote for that guy because he's useless, you know, stick with what you know. But, like, what you know doesn't seem to involve some sort of overarching, inspirational policy platform. I was just going to say, though, I always find it annoying when politicians say, of whatever political stripe, we created these jobs. Politicians don't create jobs, right? Businesses create jobs, small businesses create jobs, they take risks, and, you know, the government plays a role in that economy. But Scott Morrison is not personally creating jobs. It's ridiculous.
On Job Seeker, the Labor, was it a new decision or no great surprise that they've decided not to touch it? Not even, I mean, they'll review it, they say, at each budget, but not some sort of independent review on the rate of Job Seeker. There are, in fact, 150,000 more people on Job Seeker than pre-pandemic. But they're not going to touch it. They are able to afford the stage 3 tax cuts, though, Andrew.
Well, yes. I think this is just something that perhaps we haven't really noticed until they were asked about it. And it is, I think it's fundamentally, there's no votes in it. The focus is on the unemployment rate being so low, despite obviously the gaffe moment this week. And it's also about what happens post-election, where there's going to have to be some budget repair.
There was also this moment on border protection policy when Anthony Albanese was talking about boat turnbacks, but seemed to indicate you wouldn't need offshore processing. Have a look.
We'll turn boats back. Turning boats back means that you don't need offshore detention.
Well, the Prime Minister leapt all over that. Labor confused on border protection and so on, and Anthony Albanese had to clear it up.
Could you just clarify whether or not you plan on ditching offshore processing?
Of course not. It was established in 2013 when I was the Deputy Prime Minister.
Andrew, a bit loose in the language on a sensitive issue for Labor.
This is, again, it just shows you've got to be precise in your language, right? Would Kevin Rudd have made this mistake? No. Would Bill Shorten have made this mistake? No. Would Chris Bowen have made this mistake? No. He opened the door needlessly because, of course, Labor cannot afford there being any difference between it and the coalition on boat turnbacks or offshore processing. But he left it hanging, and it's the imprecision with which Anthony Albanese has spoken this week that would be of some concern within Labor ranks.
I think there's two key moments to always keep in mind when you talk about Anthony Albanese and boat turnbacks. One was in 2015, which wasn't that long ago, when the ALP conference dealt with this issue. Bill Shorten basically put his leadership on the line to get through turnbacks, and Anthony Albanese put his hand up against it. So there was a motion to oppose turnbacks, I think, that was put up by Andrew Giles and Murray Watts, and Tanya Plibersek and Penny Wong, I think, used proxies.
The two other left senior figures.
But Anthony Albanese went the whole hog and voted against it. And the other key point in Anthony Albanese's history with these issues that Peter Hartch would remember well was, I think, in 2011 when they had the incredible cabinet discussion when the Malaysian solution collapsed and how we're going to deal with this. And there was that incredible leak out of cabinet. And what happened in that meeting was Chris Bowen basically said, OK, Tony Abbott wants Nauru, we'll give him Nauru, we'll get Manus, we'll give him everything, and, you know, we'll establish offshore processing. Now, the interesting thing in that moment was Anthony Albanese was the one who actually surprised people. The left actually said, no, we don't go with offshore. Anthony Albanese supported the right on the idea of offering that to Abbott. Why? Not because he wanted offshore processing, but because he believed that Abbott would say no to whatever they wanted. So you would have essentially open borders and no offshore processing and only onshore processing, which for a brief period is exactly where they ended up, which was a mess.
Yeah, Peter, I mean, Labor, they don't want to be talking about border protection at all in this campaign.
No, because it's a historical vulnerability of theirs. So, again, well, as Andrew said, the Leader of the Opposition needs to be more careful in the language he uses, and he's not accustomed to coming under this level of detailed scrutiny.
But he hasn't also been asked why he suddenly supports boat turnbacks. I mean, he's spent his entire career opposing them. So he hasn't really explained when did he have this moment.
And in this very moment, the Australian model is being mimicked by the Brits, who are conducting offshore processing in Rwanda.
And when they came up with the Malaysian swap, which ended up obviously not passing, it was promoted as the virtual tow back.
That's right. A
policy.
nicer version. Right. Well, I spent some time during the week in the marginal seat of Chisholm in Melbourne's eastern suburbs. The Liberals hold that seat by a very slender margin of only 0.5 percentage point. Gladys Liu's the local member. Karina Garland is the Labor candidate trying to take the seat from her. I was keen to find out what's on the mind of voters at this stage in Chisholm. Now, this is, of course, completely unscientific, but nevertheless an interesting snapshot. What are the issues that matter to you the most?
It's a bucket list of stuff, really. Environment, cost of living, public transport, great gridlock on the roads, and pandemic.
The environment. The environment, yep.
Number 1, 2 and 3.
1, 2 and 3, absolutely.
Health, education. I'm one of those strong advocates that I don't really care about, and I don't care about a lot of things, but health and education.
Economy, living expenses.
Cost of living's a big one.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Definitely.
Student debt is definitely one thing, because it's always just something in the back of my head. But I'm always confused on, like, I don't know, no matter what happens, it seems like nothing ever changes.
I'm a Liberal voter, I'll put it out there. So for me it's better, and it becomes a very self-interest thing, realistically. What's in it for me? And all that sort of stuff. But
so how do you think Scott Morrison's gone as a Prime Minister? What do you think of him?
He's made many mistakes, but I think it's you can't be all things to all people.
Oh, he's really bungled it the past couple of years, I reckon.
Why do you say that?
Well, I don't know. I think I'm just kind of going off what everyone else is saying.
Personally, don't particularly like him. Just a defensive mindset, or just the way he talks is always defensive. So yeah, just lighten up, dude.
Look, I'd give him a pass mark, not a high pass mark.
He seems to be a bit running away from the scene a bit too often.
No comment. I don't mind him. He's doing all right. So yeah, but I really have not much idea of what's going on.
What do you think of him as a Prime Minister?
Don't like him.
What about Anthony Albanese?
Not too bad. They're both probably on par. Probably don't know enough about him yet.
And what about Anthony Albanese?
He's got a lot of great ideas of what he needs to do going forward. So there is a differentiator between him and ScoMo. But he's an unknown.
Don't know him that well, but it seems lovely. But whether I would vote for him, I don't know.
Have you made up your mind yet?
No.
And what issues have you noticed this week in the campaign? Anything jumped out to you this week?
People not knowing numbers and stuff like that, which is quite silly. I mean, he's not going to know always what every number is, even while it's moving. So, I don't know, let's focus on the big stuff.
What about Anthony Albanese?
I have no idea who that is, at all.
Well, I think the gaffe on Monday almost said it all. He's not across it, he should be.
Have you made up your mind yet?
No, not yet. I guess I'll make up my mind closer to the election.
Have you made up your mind yet?
No.
And last one, anything you've noticed this week in the campaign?
Oh, politics is a blood sport, so they go at each other's throats pretty hard.
He's right about that. I think the take out there, and as I say, there's lots of focus groups going on, and people hear from voters and so on. But the thing that comes, there's not a lot of passion for either leader. A lot of people don't know much about Anthony Albanese. A lot of people still haven't made up their mind in a pretty marginal seat.
You don't get a strong sense from that. Unscientific as it was, as you said, David. There's no strong mood for change. That's the thing. And that's a seat that Labor has got in its possibles column. They're hoping that they can win Chisholm. Based on that vox pop you did, they've got a lot of people to convince.
And look, some of the things that are coming through from the qualitative pollsters is that, or the qualitative surveyors of the public mood, is that an observation one made recently was that when Labor does win from opposition, win government from opposition, they have a charismatic leader, Gough Whitlam, Bob Hawke, Kevin Rudd. That's the question that's confronting Labor now. Do they have that charismatic leader that does allow people in Chisholm to say, I know who Albo is? And remarkably, that woman never heard of him.
No. John Howard wasn't really a charismatic leader in 1986, was he?
No, that's a fair point. All right, well, our panel, Andrew Probyn, Samantha Maiden, Peter Harcher, are going to be back shortly with some final observations. Time now for Mike Bowers and Talking Pictures.
I'm Mike Bowers and I'm photographer at large for The Guardian Australia. I'm talking pictures this morning with Craig Rucastle, who's the director of The Big Deal, still available on iView.
On iView, go and watch, yes.
Yes. How are you, mate?
Very good, very good.
Pumped for election 22?
Oh, I wouldn't go that far.
Why not? Come on.
I'm trying to grow a beard so it goes over my eyes and I can't see any of it.
Well, it's finally here and it's the race that stops the notion. Johannes Leek, who I think's onto something here. Perhaps we could have, instead of preferred Prime Minister, you could have least
hated.
Hated.
Yes.
Yeah.
I think that's kind of how it works a lot of the time, to be honest.
Look, the photos from out on the election campaign.
A lot of kids. A lot of kids, I think their elbows going, you know, how come this child hasn't fallen at the first obstacle like I did?
Ball sports, pretty predictable, sort of fair for the first week.
Yeah. I mean, I just got the note home from my kids' school where you got to sign in saying, are your kids available for political props? Look at it.
No.
No. It's good to see Father Bob. Like, I guess ScoMo got a miracle, so Albo's looking for one now. He's going to Father Bob.
Craig, the people on the Prime Minister's campaign tell me they haven't done many things, sort of, you know, street walks or sort of subjected him to the public very much.
It was very stage managed. Yeah. This one's a perfect example of that, because I reckon his PR advisors have gone, hang on a second, Albo's got a beer, we've got to have a beer.
We've got to have a beer.
But the thing about it is that this is printed out, there's actually no beer in it. So this is an empty vessel, and so is the can.
And a sewing machine. You know?
I know. The man just being himself. He's a big sewer. I mean, he knows everything about it. Look, he's looking at this, he's pointing at it going, do you know me? Yeah. And they're going, yeah, sadly we do.
I'm not quite sure what's going on here.
I don't know what's going on here.
The dog's licking his face.
Well, I mean, he does do the laying of the hands on people. He's doing it on dogs now, and the dog's like, I'm just going to respond.
They say politics is a numbers game, but Anthony Albanese discovered that the hard way this week.
It wasn't a great moment for Albo. It wasn't a great start for him, was it?
No,
and I think
really.
What happened is that maybe the only numbers he was memorising in the lead up to the campaign were the polling numbers. He didn't go outside that.
Yes, I'm wearing the latest from the House of Spears Autumn Campaign Collection.
It's fantastic.
Yeah. Brett Lethbridge, he found some unusual partners in John Howard. Who would have thought?
Yeah, but I love the fact that John Howard the first day was like, basically, who cares?
Yeah, and then the second day.
And the second day he's like, no, this is the very important thing, But
he got to talking points.
It was nice to see, because the first Howard moment was that strange moment of somebody forgetting what side they're on and just replying honestly to a question, which can never happen on a campaign trail.
I did love this Kadelka, Craig. The old how many jelly beans in the jar trick.
Oh, I'm sure I don't know what you're talking about. How many jelly beans in a jar, Albo?
I knew it. Alan Moyer, what's half the interest rate divided by 7?
What's the March jobless rate for under 40s?
What's the price of a gallon of whipped cream?
What's Zelensky's middle name?
Gotcha. Megan Herbert has some reasons why the delays are happening. The real issue is the inexperienced travellers like that guy.
Was it Gate 5 or 4 or 5.4?
Yeah, Building Australia Fund, bushfire response,
delayed.
Hawaii on time, climate action,
cancelled,
COVID response,
delayed,
aged care reform,
delayed,
Integrity Commission,
delayed,
Indigenous voice to Parliament,
delayed,
French sub-deal,
cancelled,
flood relief,
delayed.
And ICAC now looks like canned.
Excuse me, I think you'll find that's the Labor Party's problem. That's their fault.
They wouldn't support it.
It's the Labor Party's fault that the Liberal Party have not delivered their election promise. It's always confusing.
Yeah, I know. George Christensen's never been the shy retiring type, but this week he announced he's giving politics another go. And I tell you, I was shocked. When I heard he was going, shocked. I tell you, shocked. Lovely David Rowe, the resurrection of Christensen, One Nation, Aussie pride, show me the money, love it all.
Does David Rowe ever put anybody with a shirt on? I don't think he ever does.
No.
And this is why I stay out of politics, just because I don't want to see what David Rowe thinks I look like without a shirt on.
Craig, thanks very much for unpicking this first week of the campaign. I'll let you do the honours.
Has it only been the first week? Oh, no.
I know.
Back to you, Spearsy.
Very good, thank you both. Let's get some final observations. Peter, you first.
Well, it's Easter Sunday, and as we just heard then, there's lots of puns about political miracles and resurrections and renewals. I'd just like to make the point that in Francis Fukuyama's magisterial 2-volume history of politics, he makes the point that historically democracies evolve or they die. I would like, as my Easter wish, political Easter wish at least, for Australian democracy to renew. The most obvious and vital way to do that is a National Integrity Commission. I hope out of the disasters of recent political impasse, we can have some renewal and somehow miraculously from the next Parliament get one. The country needs it and our democracy needs it. And it's also a pretty good political equity to own for the party that can say, we are the party that brought you integrity.
Sam.
Well, I've got an observation about Jacques Derrida. No, I don't, actually.
That's mine.
Basically, I was just thinking how strange and surprising it was. We didn't get a chance to talk about Ben Small, the WA senator that
briefly
Daisy found out that he breached Section 44.
How about the timing?
And just to quote Peter Harcher again, who wrote that column during the week about mummies and daddies, go look that up. It was interesting because Ben Small ticked the New Zealand daddy box in December 2020. So how weird that the Liberal Party never thought, oh,
he could be a dual
he's got a New Zealand dad. But they only found it out after, you know, a couple of years.
Yes.
Handy.
How about that, Andrew?
I've got three things. Love his jacket.
Amazing.
Secondly, if you want a weekly compendium of the week in politics during an election campaign, go and watch The Brief. It's on iView. And thirdly, whoever wins, there's going to be a reckoning that comes before this country, and that is how much we spend and how much we've actually got, and there's a huge structural deficit inside this budget. That is the legacy of this government, and it's a legacy that both sides of politics have to deal with.
Yeah, and important to keep reminding both sides of that during the campaign, no doubt about it. Thank you all, especially for a whole 90 minutes this morning. No,
Happy Easter, David.
Really enjoyed it. Happy Easter to all of you and to you at home as well. Now, a couple of things before we go. Have a listen to the Australia Votes podcast too, where we'll take you through what's happening each day of the campaign. You can find that